Story 7 of Christmas Stories from French and Spanish Writers by Antoinette Ogden. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 7, The Three Low Masses, from the French of Alphonse Daudet. 1. 2 truffled turkeys, did you say, Garrigou? Yes, my reverend, 2 great, glorious turkeys stuffed with truffles. I ought to know something about it, considering I helped stuff them myself. I thought their skins would crack when they were roasting, they were stretched so tight. Merciful saints! And I'm so fond of truffles, too. Hurry there, Garrigou. Hand me my surplus. And what else did you see in the kitchen, besides the turkeys? Oh, all sorts of things. Ever since 12 o'clock we have been plucking pheasants, hoopoes, hazel hens, and heathcocks. From the pond they brought in eels, goldfish, trouts, and— About how big were the trouts, Garrigou? Oh, about so big, my reverend, as simply enormous. Holy fathers! I can see them. Did you put the wine in the vases? Yes, my reverend, I filled them. But, mercy, that isn't anything like the wine you'll have later, after midnight mass. You ought to see the dining hall at the castle, all the decanters glittering with the many-colored wines, and the silver, the plate, the chased centerpieces, the flowers, the candelabrum. I don't suppose there has ever been such a Christmas supper. The Lord Marquis has invited all the lords of the neighboring estates. There will be over 40 at the table, leaving out the bailiff and the notary. Oh, my reverend, you are very lucky to be invited. The smell of the truffles haunts me now, simply from having sniffed at those turkeys. Meuh! Come, my child, let us beware of the sin of greediness, particularly in the night of the Nativity. Hurry off now, and light the tapers and ring the first call for Mass. It will soon be midnight, and we can't afford to lose time. This conversation occurred one Christmas night in the year of our Lord 1600 and something, between the Reverend Dom Balaguère, formerly prior of the Barnabites, and present chaplain of the Sires of Trinquelague, and his little clerk, or rather what he believed to be his little clerk, Garrigou. For let me tell you that the devil on that particular night had assumed the round face and uncertain features of the young sacristan, the better to lead the reverend father into temptation and make him commit a great sin of greediness. So, while the would-be Garrigou rang out the chimes with all his might from the seigneurial chapel, the reverend father was slipping on his chasuble in the little vestry, and as his imagination was somewhat excited by Garrigou's gastronomic accounts, he repeated mechanically as he got into his vestments, 2 roast turkeys, goldfish, trouts, about so big. Without, the night wind blew and scattered the music of the bells. Gradually lights began to pierce the gloom along the roads of Mount Ventoux, on whose summit the old towers of Trinquelague reared their mighty heads. The neighboring farmers and their families were on their way to the castle to hear midnight mass. They climbed the mountain, singing gaily in little groups of 5 or 6, the father ahead carrying the lantern, the women following, wrapped in great dark cloaks under which the children snuggled to keep warm. In spite of the cold and the advanced hour of the night, all these good people walked along merrily, cheered by the thought that a great supper was awaiting them as usual below in the castle kitchens after mass. Every now and then, on the rough declivity, some fine lord's coach, preceded by torch-bearers, showed its glimmering window-panes in the moonlight. Or then a mule trotted along shaking its bells, or again, by the light of their lanterns, wrapped in mist, the farmers recognized their bailiff and hailed him as they passed. Good night, Master Anatole. Good night, my children." It was a clear night, the stars seemed brightened by the cold, the wind was nipping, and a fine sleet powdered all those cloaks without wetting them, just in order to preserve the tradition that requires Christmas to be white with snow. On the very crest of the mountain the castle appeared like a goal, with its huge mass of towers and gables, the chapel steeple rising straight into the blue-black sky, while 1,000 little lights moved rapidly hither and thither, blinking at all the windows, and looking, against the intense black of the building, like the tiny sparks that glimmer in a pile of burnt paper. After passing the drawbridge and the postern, in order to reach the chapel, one had to cross the first court, crowded with coaches, footmen, sedan chairs, and bright with the flame of torches and the glare from the kitchens. One could hear the clicking of the spits, the rattling of pots, the tinkling of crystal and silver as they were laid out for the banquet; and above it all floated a warm vapor, smelling of roasted meats and the pungent herbs of complicated sauces, which made the farmers, as well as the chaplain, the bailiff, and everybody else say, "What a good supper we shall have after Mass!" 2. Ding-ling-ling, ding-ling-ling. Midnight Mass has begun. In the chapel of the castle, which is a miniature cathedral with intercrossed arches and oaken wainscoting up to the ceiling, all the tapestries are hung, all the tapers lighted. What a crowd of people, and what sumptuous costumes! Here, in one of the carven stalls that surround the choir, sits the Sire of Trinquelague, clad in salmon-colored silk, and around him all the noble lords, his guests. Opposite them, on velvet fall-stools, kneel the old Dowager Marchioness, in a gown of flame-colored brocade, and the young lady of Trinquelague, wearing on her pretty head a great tower of lace, puffed and quilled according to the latest fashion at the court of France. Farther down the aisle, all dressed in black, with vast pointed wigs and cleanly shaven chins, sat Thomas Arnoton, the bailiff, and the notary, Master Ambroy, two sombre spots amid the high colors of silks and brocaded damasks. Then come the fat major domos, the pages, outriders, the stewards, Dame Barbe, with her great bunch of keys dangling from her side on a ring of fine silver. On the benches in the rear is the lower service, butlers, maids, the farmers and their families, and last of all, far back against the doors, which they discreetly open and close, come the cooks, between two sauces, to catch a little whiff of the Mass, bringing with them into the bedecked church, warm with the light of so many tapers, odoriferous suggestions of the Christmas supper. Can it be the sight of these crisp white caps that diverts the Reverend Father's attention? Or is it not rather Garrigou's bell, that fiendish little bell that tinkles away at the foot of the altar with such infernal haste, and seems to be saying, "Come, come, let us hurry. The sooner we dispatch the service, the sooner we go to supper"? The fact of the matter is that at every peal from this little devil of a bell, the chaplain forgets his Mass and allows his mind to wander to the Christmas supper. He evokes visions of busy kitchens, with ovens glowing like furnaces, warm vapors rising from under tin lids, and through these vapors two superb turkeys, stuffed, crammed, mottled with truffles. Or then again he sees long files of little pages carrying great dishes wrapped in their tempting fumes, and with them he is about to enter the dining hall. What ecstasy! Here stands the immense table, laden and dazzling, with peacocks dressed in their feathers, pheasants spreading their bronzed wings, ruby-colored decanters, pyramids of luscious fruit amid the foliage, and those wonderful fish that Garrigou spoke of. Garrigou, forsooth! Reclining on a bed of fennel, their pearly scales looking as if they were just from the pond, and a bunch of pungent herbs in their monster-like nostrils. This beatific vision is so vivid that Dom Balaguère actually fancies that the glorious dishes are being served before him on the very embroideries of the altar-cloth, and instead of saying Dominus vobiscum, he catches himself saying the Benedicite. With the exception of these slight mistakes, the worthy man rattled off the service conscientiously, without skipping a line or omitting a genuflection, and all went well to the end of the first Mass. For you must know that on Christmas the same officiating priest is obliged to say 3 Masses consecutively. "So much for one," thought the chaplain with a sigh of relief, and without losing a second he motioned his clerk, or him whom he believed to be his clerk, and ding-ling-ling, ding-ling-ling, the second Mass has begun, and with it Dom Balaguère's sin. "Come, let us hurry," says Garrigou's bell in a shrill, devilish little voice, at the mere sound of which the unfortunate priest pounces upon the missal and devours its pages with all the avidity of his over-excited brain. He kneels and rises frantically, barely sketches the sign of the cross and the genuflections, and shortens all of his gestures in order to get through sooner. He scarcely extends his arms at the Gospel or strikes his breast at the Confiteor. Between him and his little clerk it is hard to tell who mumbles the faster. The words, half uttered between their teeth, for it would take them too long to open their lips every time, die out into unintelligible murmurs. Oremus, mea culpa. Like hurried vintagers crushing the grapes in the mash tuns, they both splashed about in the Latin of the service, splattering it in every direction. "Tom scum," says Balaguer. "Stutuo," responds Garrigou, while the infernal little bell jingles in their ears like the sleigh bells that are put on stage horses to hasten their speed. You may well imagine that at such a rate a low mass is soon rattled off. "So much for the second," says the panting chaplain, with scarlet face, in a full perspiration, and without taking time to breathe, he goes tumbling down the altar steps, and ding-ling-ling, ding-ling-ling-ling, the third Mass is under way. Only a few minutes stand between them and the supper. But alas! as the time approaches, Dom Balaguer's fever of impatience and greediness increases. His vision grows more and more vivid. The fish, the roasted turkeys, are there before him. He touches them. Great heavens! He breathes the perfume of the wines and the savory fumes of the dishes, and the frantic little bells call out to him, "Hurry, hurry, faster, faster!" But how on earth can he go faster? His lips barely move. He has given up enunciating altogether, unless, forsooth, he chooses to cheat the Lord and swindle him out of his Mass. And that is just what he is doing, the wretched man. Yielding first to one temptation, then another, he skips one verse, then two, then, the epistle being very long, he omits part of it, skims over the Gospel, passes the Creed unnoticed, skips the Pater, hails the preface from afar, and thus without a skip and a jump plunges into eternal damnation, followed by that infamous Garrigou, Vade retro Satanas, who seconds him with marvellous sympathy, upholds his chasuble, turns the pages two at a time, jostles the lectern, and upsets the vases, while the little bell rings constantly, ever faster and louder. It would be impossible to describe the bewildered expression of the congregation. Compelled to follow, mimicking the priest, through this Mass of which they can make neither head nor tail, some stand while others kneel, some sit while others stand. And all the phases of this singular service are jumbled together along the benches in the greatest confusion of varied postures. The Christmas star on the celestial road, journeying toward the little manger yonder, grows pale at the very thought. "The Abbé reads too fast. It is impossible to follow him," whispers the old dowager Marchioness, whose voluminous headdress shakes wildly. Master Arnoton, with his great steel spectacles on his nose, loses his place every minute, and fingers his prayer book nervously. Still, at heart, all these good people, whose minds are equally bent upon the Christmas supper, are not at all disturbed at the idea of following Mass at such breakneck speed; and when Dom Balaguer, facing them radiantly, exclaims in a thundering voice, "Ite missa est," the response, "Deo gratias," is so unanimous, joyous, and spirited, that anyone might take it for the first toast of the supper. 3. 5 minutes later the assembled lords, the chaplain among them, had taken their seats in the great hall. The castle, brilliantly illumined, echoed with songs and laughter, and the venerable Dom Balaguer drove his fork resolutely into a capon's wing, drowning the remorse for his sin in the savory juice of meats and the soothing draughts of old wine. He ate and drank so heartily, the dear old man, that he died of a spasm that very night, without even having had time to repent. By morning he reached heaven, where the thrills of the past night's ecstasies lingered still in the air, and I leave you to imagine how he was received. "Get thee gone, thou wretched Christian," said St. Peter. "Thy sin is great enough to wipe out the virtues of a lifetime. Ah, so thou wouldst swindle us out of a Mass! Very well, then, 300 Masses shalt thou say, nor shalt thou enter into Paradise until 300 Christmas Masses have been celebrated in thine own chapel, and in the presence of all those who sinned with thee and through thee." And in this is the true legend of Dom Balaguère, as it is told in the land of the olive trees. The castle of Trinquelague has long since ceased to exist, but the chapel stands erect on the crest of Mount Ventoux, in a clump of evergreen oaks. The wind sways its unhinged door, the grass grows over the threshold, there are nests in the angles of the altar and on the sills of the high ogivy windows, whose jewelled panes have long since disappeared. Still it seems that every year at Christmas supernatural, mysterious lights hover among the ruins, and on their way to midnight Mass and the Christmas supper, the peasants see this spectre of a chapel lighted by invisible tapers, which burn in the open air, even in the wind and under the snow. You may laugh if you will, but a wine dresser of the district named Garrigou, a descendant of the Garrigou no doubt, has often told me that on one particular Christmas night, being somewhat in liquor, he had lost his way on the mountain, somewhere near Trinquelague, and this is what he saw. Until 11 o'clock, nothing. Everything was silent and dark. Suddenly, at midnight, the chimes rang out from the old steeple, strange, uncanny chimes that seemed to be ringing 1,000 miles away. Soon lights began to tremble along the road, and vague shadows moved about. Under the portal of the chapel there were sounds of footsteps and muffled voices. "Good night, Master Arnoton." "Good night, my children." When they had all gone in, my wine dresser, who was a courageous fellow, crawled up to the door, and there beheld a most marvellous spectacle. All these good shadows sat around the choir in the ruined nave, just as though the benches were still there. There were fine ladies in brocades and lace headdresses, lords gaily bedizened, peasants in flowered coats like those our grandfathers wore, all of them dusty, faded, weary. Every now and then some night bird, an habitual lodger in the chapel, awakened by all these lights, began to flutter about the tapers, whose flames rose erect and vague as though they were burning behind a strip of gauze. Garrigou was particularly amused at a gentleman with great steel spectacles, who constantly shook his huge black wig, upon which perched one of these birds with entangled claws and beating wings. A little old man with a childlike figure knelt in the centre of the choir, and frantically shook a tiny bell, which had lost its voice, while a priest clad in old gold vestments moved hither and thither before the altar, repeating orisons of which not a syllable could be heard. Who could this have been but Dom Balaguère, saying his third low Mass? End of Story 7.